Before Genghis Khan, the world had never seen anything quite like the Mongols. They came from a land that seemed, at first glance, almost impossible to conquer from. A vast country of grasslands and cold winds, where cities were rare, forests were distant, and survival depended on horses, livestock, weather, and the ability to move before the next season changed. Yet from this landscape emerged a people who would reshape the political map of Eurasia. Within little more than a century, armies born on the Mongolian steppe would cross thousands of miles of territory, defeat kingdoms that had existed for centuries, destroy cities that had been centers of civilization since antiquity, establish new dynasties in China, dominate Persia and Central Asia, reshape Russia, reach Eastern Europe, and create the largest contiguous empire the world had ever known. Their armies could appear almost impossibly far from home. Their messengers could cross enormous distances with remarkable speed. Their commanders could coordinate cavalry forces over landscapes where ordinary armies struggled simply to survive. And their enemies faced a terrifying choice: fight the Mongols and risk destruction, or submit before the Mongol army arrived. But the story of the Mongol Empire is not simply a story about conquest. It is a story about transformation. Because the same empire that destroyed cities also connected distant civilizations. The same rulers who ordered brutal campaigns could protect merchants, employ scholars from conquered peoples, and permit different religions to exist side by side. The same network that carried luxury goods and ideas across Eurasia would eventually help carry disease along those same routes. And the man who began this transformation was not born an emperor. He was born Temüjin. His childhood was shaped not by palaces, but by danger. Not by certainty, but by abandonment, hunger, betrayal, and the constant struggle for survival. Somewhere on the Mongolian steppe, during the 12th century, a boy was growing up in a world where political power could disappear overnight, where alliances could last only until they stopped being useful, and where a family without powerful allies could quickly become vulnerable to everyone around it. That boy would eventually become known to history as Genghis Khan, and before his armies conquered kingdoms, he first had to conquer something much closer to home: the Mongols themselves. Welcome to Shaded Past. If you enjoy calm, immersive journeys through the darker and forgotten chapters of history, subscribe and stay with us, because tonight we are going back to the beginning of one of the most extraordinary transformations the medieval world ever witnessed. We begin not with an empire, but with the steppe. The Mongolian steppe was a landscape that could look almost empty to an outsider. There were no endless stone cities, no dense network of paved roads, no enormous agricultural kingdoms stretching across the horizon. Instead, there were grasslands, mountains, rivers, deserts, and an immense open sky. Life there demanded mobility. People followed their herds. Families lived in portable, felt dwellings. Horses were not simply transportation. They were essential to survival. A skilled rider could travel enormous distances, hunt from horseback, communicate between camps, and carry supplies without depending on roads or large settlements. From childhood, Mongol boys learned to ride. They learned to shoot. They learned to endure cold, hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty. And the society that developed from this environment was built around relationships of loyalty. Clan mattered, family mattered, personal alliances mattered, but loyalty could be fragile. A powerful leader could gather followers today and lose them tomorrow. A defeated clan could disappear into another tribe. A marriage could create an alliance. A betrayal could destroy one. This was the world into which Temüjin was born. The exact year of his birth is uncertain. Many traditional accounts place it around 1162, although historians debate the precise date. What matters more than the number is the environment into which he was born. His father was Yesugei, a leader of the Borjigin clan. Temüjin's mother was Holan. According to the traditional accounts, Temüjin's early life was marked by both privilege and sudden disaster. His father arranged a marriage alliance for him while he was still young, connecting him with the family of Borte, a girl who would later become one of the most important people in his life. But before Temüjin could grow into adulthood, his world collapsed. His father died, and with his death, the protection of the family disappeared. Temüjin's family was abandoned by their former followers. They were left with little food and few resources. The people who had once depended upon Temüjin's father now had little reason to remain loyal to his widow and children. For the family, survival became the first objective. They gathered roots. They hunted what they could. They survived on whatever the surrounding land provided. Holen, Temüjin's mother, became central to that struggle. She had to keep her children alive in a society where weakness could invite exploitation. The boy who would later command enormous armies therefore learned something before he learned to command. He learned what it meant to have nothing. He learned how quickly loyalty could disappear. And he learned that survival depended not only on strength, but on judgment. The steppe did not forgive mistakes. As Temüjin grew older, he began forming relationships of his own. Some were friendships. Some were alliances. Some would become rivalries that shaped the future of the Mongol world. One of the most important was his relationship with Jamukha. The two young men became sworn brothers. For a time, their friendship represented the possibility of a powerful partnership. But the steppe was changing around them, and both men wanted something larger. Temüjin increasingly attracted followers who were willing to follow him not simply because of his birth, but because they believed he could provide security, opportunity, and victory. That distinction would become one of his greatest advantages. Traditional steppe society placed enormous importance on lineage, but Temüjin increasingly rewarded ability. A man who proved himself could rise. A warrior who demonstrated loyalty could gain status. A talented commander could become powerful regardless of his original clan. This was revolutionary in a society where old tribal structures had often determined a person's position. Temüjin was not simply gathering an army, he was gradually building a new political system, and that system would eventually become the foundation of the Mongol Empire. But before that empire could exist, Temüjin had to defeat the people who stood between him and the unification of the steppe. The struggle was brutal. Rival tribes fought each other for generations. The Tatars, Merkids, Keraids, Naimans, and other groups competed for territory, influence, and survival. Temüjin used warfare, diplomacy, marriage alliances, intelligence, and political manipulation. He also understood something fundamental about human loyalty. People followed leaders who could protect them, and they abandoned leaders who could not. As Temüjin defeated rivals, he absorbed their followers rather than simply destroying them. This gave his movement a strange quality. Every victory made him stronger. Every defeated enemy could become another source of soldiers, information, and experience. His army grew. His reputation grew with it, and his enemies increasingly faced a problem they had not encountered before. They were not fighting one isolated tribe. They were fighting a system that could absorb defeat and return stronger. Temüjin's campaigns also demonstrated the importance of intelligence. The Mongols did not simply charge blindly across the landscape. They gathered information. They questioned merchants. They observed rival political divisions. They identified weaknesses. They learned about roads, rivers, fortifications, and the political relationships between neighboring states. Information became a weapon, and mobility made that weapon even more powerful. A Mongol army could move rapidly across the steppe. Its soldiers were accustomed to traveling with minimal supplies. They could hunt. They could carry multiple bows. They could change mounts. They could communicate across distances. The horse was not simply part of the Mongol military system, it was the foundation of it. A Mongol warrior could spend enormous amounts of time in the saddle. This created a kind of mobility that many settled armies could not match. But mobility alone could not create an empire. Temüjin needed unity. In 1206, that opportunity arrived. A great assembly of Mongol leaders gathered on the steppe. This kind of gathering was known as a Kurultai. Here, Temüjin was recognized as the supreme ruler of the Mongols. He took the title Genghis Khan. The exact meaning of the title remains debated, but its significance was unmistakable. Temüjin was no longer merely the leader of one clan. He was the Great Khan. The tribes of the Mongolian steppe had been brought together under one political authority. And this was the moment when the Mongol Empire began to take recognizable form. But Genghis Khan understood that defeating his enemies was not enough. He had to prevent the old tribal system from simply returning. So he reorganized society. He broke down older tribal divisions and reorganized people into military units that were designed to create loyalty to the new state. The army became more than a collection of tribes. It became an institution. Men were organized into groups of tens, hundreds, thousands, and larger formations. Commanders were increasingly chosen for competence and loyalty. The old question of which tribe a warrior belonged to became less important than the question of whom he served. This transformation was one of the secrets of Mongol power. Genghis Khan was turning a fragmented society into a machine capable of coordinated action. He also understood the importance of communication. The Mongols developed a network of relay stations that allowed messengers to move across enormous distances. Fresh horses could be made available. Messages could travel quickly. Orders could reach commanders far from the central court. For an empire spread across vast territories, communication was not a luxury. It was survival. Genghis Khan also supported the development of written administration. The Mongols adopted the Uyghur script for writing Mongolian. Laws and orders could be recorded. Officials could communicate. The expanding state could preserve information beyond the memory of individual leaders. And gradually, something remarkable was happening. The Mongols were becoming more than conquerors. They were becoming administrators. But their transformation did not make them peaceful. If anything, unification gave Genghis Khan the ability to look outward with greater confidence. The tribes of the steppe were no longer his primary obstacle. Beyond Mongolia were wealthy kingdoms. China lay to the south and east. Central Asia contained prosperous cities connected by ancient trade routes. The Islamic world stretched across Persia and beyond. Farther west were the powerful states of Eastern Europe. These lands possessed something the Mongolian steppe did not: enormous populations, agricultural wealth, cities, treasuries, trade networks, fortifications, and political divisions. For Genghis Khan, the world beyond the steppe was now within reach. The first targets were closer to home. The western Xia kingdom stood along the routes leading toward China. The Yuan Dynasty controlled much of northern China and represented a major political and military power. These were not easy opponents. The Mongols had mastered the open steppe. But attacking fortified cities was different. A cavalry army could dominate a battlefield and still struggle against walls. Genghis Khan therefore adapted. The Mongols began incorporating engineers and specialists from conquered peoples. Chinese and Central Asian experts understood siege warfare. They knew how to build machines capable of attacking fortified positions. They knew how to construct defensive works. They understood technologies that the steppe warriors themselves had not traditionally needed. The Mongols learned. This willingness to absorb useful knowledge would become another defining feature of their empire. They did not always destroy the expertise of conquered peoples. They often captured it. Then they used it. A city that resisted might be destroyed. A specialist who surrendered might be given a place within the Mongol system. This combination of terror and incorporation made the Mongol conquests extraordinarily difficult to resist. The Mongols could destroy one civilization and then recruit its survivors to help conquer the next. And soon, their attention would turn west. Beyond the mountains and deserts of Central Asia was a powerful state known as the Khwarezmian Empire. It controlled a huge territory and some of the richest cities of the Islamic world. At first, there was no obvious reason why Genghis Khan and the Khwarezmian ruler Muhammad II had to become enemies. Trade could have connected them. Diplomacy could have benefited both sides. Genghis Khan was interested in commerce. The Mongols understood the value of merchants. A peaceful relationship with the Khwarezmian state could have opened enormous opportunities. But a diplomatic disaster would change everything. A Mongol trade and diplomatic mission entered Khwarezmian territory. The situation deteriorated. Merchants were accused of wrongdoing. The governor of Otrar seized them. The men were killed. Genghis Khan sent envoys demanding an explanation. One of those envoys was reportedly killed. Another was humiliated. For Genghis Khan, this was not a minor diplomatic insult. It was an attack on the authority of the Mongol state, and the response would be catastrophic. In 1219, the Mongol armies moved west. They crossed enormous distances. They did not march toward one single battlefield. They attacked the Khwarezmian Empire across multiple directions. Cities that had seemed secure suddenly found themselves surrounded. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench. The Mongol advance was relentless. The Khwarezmian ruler possessed larger populations and substantial resources, but his empire was politically divided. His armies were scattered. His commanders struggled to coordinate, and Genghis Khan exploited every weakness. The Mongols moved quickly. They isolated cities. They destroyed resistance where necessary. They captured specialists. They gathered intelligence. They used terror as psychological warfare. The reputation of the Mongol army began arriving before the army itself. A city that heard what had happened elsewhere might surrender before the walls were even surrounded. This was one of the most terrifying aspects of Mongol warfare. The psychological battle could begin long before the physical one. The Mongols understood that fear could save them time, and time was one of their most valuable resources. The Khwarezmian Empire began collapsing. Its ruler fled westward. His armies were defeated or scattered, and Genghis Khan's empire suddenly stood across an enormous section of Central Asia. But the campaign did not end there. Mongol commanders Jebei and Subutai were sent on an extraordinary expedition. They travelled farther west than almost anyone in the Mongol world could have imagined. Their forces moved through the Caucasus. They fought local armies. They encountered the forces of the Kievan Rus. And they demonstrated something that would become characteristic of Mongol warfare. They could operate far beyond their original homeland. The Mongol Empire was no longer a regional power. It was becoming a Eurasian power. Yet even as Genghis Khan's armies expanded, the man himself remained at the center of the system. He had created something that depended heavily on personal authority. His family, his commanders, his laws, his military organization, his reputation. All of these held the growing empire together. But every empire built around one extraordinary ruler eventually faces the same question. What happens when that ruler dies? Genghis Khan would not live forever, and when his death finally came in 1227, the Mongol Empire had already become something the world had never seen before. But its greatest expansions had not yet happened. His sons and grandsons would take the system he created and push it even farther. They would conquer new lands. They would build new states. They would reach deeper into China. They would move into Russia and Eastern Europe. They would establish the Golden Horde. They would create the Ilkhanate in Persia. And eventually, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons would establish the Yuan Dynasty in China. The empire was about to enter the most spectacular phase of its expansion, and the world beyond Mongolia was about to discover just how far the descendants of Temüjin intended to go. The death of Genghis Khan did not end the Mongol expansion. In many empires, the death of the founder creates uncertainty. The ruler is gone. The generals begin competing. The conquered peoples see an opportunity. The political structure begins to fracture. But the Mongol Empire was different. Genghis Khan had spent decades building a system designed to survive beyond his own lifetime. His sons and descendants already possessed military experience. His commanders understood the organization of the army. The laws and customs of the new state had been established. And most importantly, the Mongol ruling family understood that the empire could not simply stop. There were still enemies. There were still wealthy kingdoms beyond the horizon, and there were still enormous territories that had yet to be brought under Mongol control. The man who inherited the central authority after Genghis Khan was his third son, Ögedei. He became Great Khan in 1229. Ögedei was very different from his father. He was not simply interested in military conquest. He also understood administration. Under his rule, the Mongol state became more organized. Tax systems were developed. Administrative centers expanded. Communication networks improved. The Mongols increasingly relied on officials from conquered populations to help govern the enormous territories they had acquired. But Ogedei also understood the value of conquest. The empire continued to expand in several directions. In the west, Mongol forces pushed deeper into the lands of the Kievan Rus. In the east, campaigns continued against the Jin dynasty in northern China. And farther south, the Mongols confronted the powerful Song dynasty. The Mongol Empire was becoming too large to be managed as a single army moving from one battlefield to another. It needed institutions, it needed roads, it needed taxation, it needed officials, it needed information, and it needed a way to move people and messages across territories that stretched farther than most medieval rulers could even imagine. One of the most important developments was the expansion of the relay post system. Stations were established along major routes. At these stations, official messengers could obtain fresh horses and continue their journeys. This meant that a message could travel across enormous distances far faster than a normal traveller could manage. The system was expensive. It required food, horses, guards, and administrators. But it gave the Mongol rulers something invaluable: speed. A commander hundreds or even thousands of miles from the imperial court could still receive orders. A report from a distant province could eventually reach the center. Merchants and travellers could move along protected routes, and the empire could function as a connected political space rather than a collection of isolated conquests. This network became one of the hidden foundations of Mongol power. The empire was not held together only by armies. It was held together by movement. People moved, horses moved, goods moved, messages moved, ideas moved, and eventually entire civilizations became connected through the same roads. But before that interconnected world could fully develop, the Mongols still had to defeat one of their greatest enemies in China. The Jin dynasty had ruled northern China for generations. Its cities were wealthy, its population was enormous, its armies were experienced, its fortifications were formidable. For the Mongols, conquering the steppe was one thing. Conquering northern China was something else entirely. The Mongols therefore adapted again. Siege warfare became increasingly important. Engineers from conquered regions were incorporated into Mongol forces. Chinese specialists helped construct siege weapons. Military knowledge flowed between peoples. The Mongols could learn from their enemies, and that ability to learn may have been one of the most important reasons they continued winning. They did not insist that everything had to be done in the traditional Mongolian way. If a Chinese engineer knew how to build a machine capable of breaking a wall, the Mongols used that knowledge. If a Persian administrator understood taxation, the Mongols could employ him. If a captured official knew how to govern a city, his expertise could be preserved. The empire was becoming a vast collection of different skills, and those skills could be redirected toward Mongol objectives. The Jin dynasty eventually collapsed. Its territories were absorbed into the growing Mongol sphere, but the conquest of China was not complete. The southern Song remained independent. This would become one of the greatest military challenges of the Mongol era. The Song possessed enormous resources. Its cities were sophisticated. Its economy was highly developed. Its military technology was advanced. The Mongols would eventually defeat it. But that victory would come decades later. For the moment, another region was demanding the empire's attention: Europe. The Mongol armies moving west were becoming a force that European rulers could no longer ignore. The campaign was led by Batu, a grandson of Genghis Khan, alongside the brilliant commander Subutai. Their forces entered the lands of the Kievan Rus. The political landscape they encountered was divided. Different princes controlled different territories. Rivalries weakened coordination. The Mongols exploited those divisions. City after city came under attack. Some resisted. Others surrendered. Some were destroyed. The destruction could be devastating. Cities that had stood for generations could be reduced to ruins. Thousands of people could be killed or taken captive. The psychological impact was enormous. Survivors carried stories of an enemy who seemed to appear from nowhere, move with impossible speed, and disappear before a conventional army could respond. The Mongols also used terror deliberately. A city that surrendered might receive different treatment from one that resisted. The message was simple. Submission could preserve life. Resistance could bring destruction. This was not merely brutality for its own sake. It was psychological warfare. If fear caused the next city to surrender without a prolonged siege, the Mongols saved time and casualties. And time was critical. Their armies could travel enormous distances, but they still depended on supplies, horses, information, and communication. The faster a campaign moved, the more effective their system became. In 1240, Kiev fell. The city had been one of the most important centers of the Kievan Rus. Its destruction shocked the region. The Mongol advance continued west. Soon the armies reached Central Europe. In 1241, Mongol forces fought major battles at Legnica and Mohi. European armies were unfamiliar with the Mongol style of warfare. The Mongols were masters of mounted archery. They could approach rapidly, attack from a distance, retreat deliberately, and then return when their enemies broke formation. They could appear to flee. An opposing army might pursue them. Then the Mongols would turn. The apparent retreat had become an ambush. Their commanders were patient. They studied the battlefield. They used terrain. They divided forces. They coordinated movements. And they rarely relied on a single attack when deception could achieve more. The European armies suffered heavy defeats. The Mongol forces appeared capable of moving farther west. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that much of Europe might eventually come under Mongol domination. But then something unexpected happened. Chagatai Khan died. The news travelled across the empire. The Mongol commanders faced a political problem. The election of a new great Khan required the return of important princes and leaders. The western campaign slowed. Then it stopped. The Mongol armies withdrew. For European rulers, the withdrawal was almost impossible to understand. They had witnessed an enemy that appeared unstoppable. Then the enemy simply disappeared. But the Mongols had not been defeated in Europe. Their withdrawal was driven by events inside the Mongol political system. The death of the great Khan had changed the priorities of the empire. This moment would later become one of the great historical questions surrounding the Mongol expansion. What would have happened if Chagatai had lived? Would the Mongols have continued deeper into Europe? Could they have reached the Atlantic? Could major European kingdoms have been conquered? No one can know. History had turned at a moment of political uncertainty. The Mongol Empire had reached one of its greatest possible frontiers, and then it stopped. But the empire itself continued to change. The death of Chagatai created a struggle over succession. For several years, political authority became uncertain. Eventually, Möngke became Great Khan in 1251. Under Möngke, the empire entered another major phase of expansion. His brother Kublai would focus heavily on China. Another brother, Hulagu, would lead a massive campaign into the Middle East. And once again, Mongol armies would move toward one of the great centers of medieval civilization, Baghdad. At this point, the Abbasid Caliphate still existed. Its political power was weaker than it had once been, but Baghdad remained enormously important. For centuries, it had been associated with scholarship, literature, mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and Islamic civilization. The city represented a cultural legacy that stretched back generations. Hulagu's army approached in 1258. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim faced an impossible situation. The Mongol forces were enormous. The city's defences were inadequate. Attempts at negotiation failed. The Mongols surrounded Baghdad. Siege weapons were brought forward. The city was attacked. Eventually, the defenders surrendered. The Mongols entered Baghdad. What followed became one of the most famous catastrophes of the medieval Islamic world. The city was devastated. Large numbers of people were killed. Buildings were destroyed. Libraries and institutions suffered catastrophic losses. The traditional stories surrounding the destruction of Baghdad became symbols of the destructive power of the Mongol conquest. Modern historians debate the exact scale of the casualties and the details of the destruction. But there is no serious doubt that the fall of Baghdad was a profound political and cultural shock. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad effectively ended, and the Mongol Empire now stood deep inside the Islamic world. Yet the Mongols did not simply continue westward without opposition. They encountered a new enemy, the Mamluks of Egypt. These were military rulers whose armies had developed into one of the most formidable forces in the region. The Mongols had already destroyed several powerful states. They had defeated armies across Central Asia and the Middle East. But in 1260, at Ain Jalut, the Mongols finally encountered a major battlefield defeat that would become legendary. The Mongol forces had been reduced because of political developments elsewhere. Mongol Khan had died. Hulagu had withdrawn part of his army. The Mamluks saw an opportunity. Their forces moved north. The two armies met in Palestine. The battle was intense. The Mamluks used tactics that exploited the Mongol style of warfare. They had studied their enemy. They understood that the Mongols could be vulnerable when their forces were divided. The battle ended with a Mamluk victory. For the first time, the Mongol expansion into the Middle East had been decisively stopped. The significance was enormous. The Mongols were not invincible. They could be defeated, and their empire had reached a limit. But while Mongol armies were fighting in the Middle East, another transformation was taking place farther east. Kublai Khan was becoming increasingly focused on China. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan. But unlike the founder of the empire, Kublai spent much of his life dealing with the enormous complexity of Chinese civilization. He understood that conquering China and ruling China were two very different tasks. China could not be governed simply as an extension of the Mongolian steppe. It had millions of people, ancient institutions, sophisticated bureaucracy, established traditions, a complex economy, and a political culture with thousands of years of history. Kublai therefore began adapting himself to the world he intended to rule. He established a new capital. The city that would become Khanbalik, later known as Beijing, became a major center of Mongol power. He increasingly adopted Chinese administrative practices. He employed Chinese officials. He promoted large infrastructure projects. He supported agriculture. He encouraged trade. And eventually, he founded the Yuan Dynasty. This was a remarkable transformation. The descendants of steppe nomads were now ruling China. The Mongol Empire had crossed one of the greatest cultural boundaries in Eurasia, but Kublai still faced a powerful enemy, the Southern Song. For decades, Mongol armies had struggled against the Song. The Song controlled wealthy territories in southern China. Its cities were heavily fortified. Its economy was powerful. Its military possessed advanced technology. The Mongols therefore needed a different approach. They built naval forces. They recruited Chinese engineers and sailors. They adapted siege technology. They learned to fight in environments completely different from the steppe. Eventually, after years of warfare, the Song collapsed. In 1279, the last major Song resistance was defeated. China was now under Mongol rule. For the first time, a dynasty founded by a people from the Mongolian steppe controlled the entirety of China. Kublai Khan had achieved what earlier Mongol rulers could not. He had transformed conquest into an imperial state. But this victory also created a new problem. The Mongol Empire was becoming too large to remain politically unified. Genghis Khan's original empire had been held together by personal authority and shared conquest. His descendants now ruled enormous territories with different cultures, religions, economies, and political interests. The empire was slowly becoming a collection of related states. In the west, the Golden Horde dominated much of the Eurasian steppe and the lands of Rus. In Persia, the Ilkhanate emerged. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate developed. In China, Kublai ruled the Yuan Dynasty. All of these rulers belonged to the broader Mongol imperial family, but they increasingly pursued their own interests. The dream of one unified Mongol empire was beginning to weaken, and yet something else was happening. Even as political unity declined, the connections created by Mongol rule became stronger. Trade routes were reopened. Merchants could travel across territories that had once been separated by war. Goods from China could move west. Persian craftsmen could travel east. European travelers could reach the Mongol world. Chinese technologies could spread. Knowledge could cross borders. Religions could travel. Ideas could travel. Languages could interact. The Mongol Empire had created a vast zone of contact, and this period would later be remembered as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It did not mean that the empire was peaceful everywhere. Far from it. The Mongols had created this relative stability through conquest. But once territories were under their control, the same military network that had destroyed resistance could provide security for merchants and travelers. A merchant crossing thousands of miles could sometimes travel through territories protected by the same imperial system. This changed Eurasian commerce. Silk, spices, precious metals, textiles, horses, weapons, paper, technologies, and ideas could move more efficiently than before, and with them came people. One of the most famous travelers to enter the Mongol world was a Venetian merchant whose account would later become one of the most famous travel narratives in history. His name was Marco Polo. According to his own account, he traveled to the court of Kublai Khan and spent years in the Mongol-ruled world. His descriptions of China fascinated European readers. He wrote about cities of astonishing size, about wealth, about paper money, about the imperial court, about roads and communication, about goods and customs unfamiliar to Europeans. Whether every detail of his account is accurate remains debated, but his story reflects something important. The Mongol Empire had made distant parts of Eurasia more accessible to travelers from one end of the continent to another. The world was becoming more connected, and the consequences of that connection would be enormous, because the Mongol Empire did not only move wealth and knowledge, it also moved disease. Trade routes connect people, and when people travel, diseases travel with them. In the 14th century, a devastating epidemic would spread across Eurasia, the Black Death. Its exact origins and pathways remain subjects of historical debate. But the trade networks of the Mongol world helped create conditions in which disease could move across enormous distances. The same routes that carried silk and spices could carry bacteria. The same merchants who connected cities could unintentionally connect outbreaks. The Mongol period therefore became part of a much larger transformation in Eurasian history. The continent was becoming more interconnected than ever, and with connection came both opportunity and danger. But by this time, the political unity of the Mongol Empire was already weakening. The descendants of Genghis Khan had become rulers of separate worlds. The Golden Horde was developing its own political identity. The Ilkhanate in Persia was becoming increasingly independent. The Chagatai lands experienced internal struggles. The Yuan Dynasty in China faced rebellions, economic problems, natural disasters, and political instability. The empire that had once expanded with extraordinary speed was entering a different phase. The age of conquest was slowly becoming the age of fragmentation. Yet the legacy of Genghis Khan remained. His descendants ruled vast territories. His military organization influenced later states. His empire had permanently changed the political geography of Eurasia, and the routes opened during Mongol rule continued to matter long after the empire itself began to disappear. The Mongols had done something extraordinary. They had connected worlds that had previously been separated by enormous distances, but they had also left behind a complicated legacy. To some, Genghis Khan was remembered as a destroyer. To others, he was a political genius. Some remembered the cities that burned. Others remembered the trade routes that reopened. Some remembered the millions who died during the conquests. Others remembered an empire that encouraged movement, communication, and exchange across Eurasia. The truth was not simple. The Mongol Empire was both destructive and transformative. It was built through violence. But it created systems that could later support commerce and cultural exchange. It destroyed kingdoms, but it also connected their surviving populations. It brought catastrophe, and it brought new forms of interaction. The story of the Mongols, therefore, cannot be reduced to a single word. They were not simply barbarians. They were not simply administrators. They were not simply conquerors. They were all of these things at different moments, and the deeper we follow their history, the more complicated the picture becomes, because the empire that began with a boy named Temüjin would eventually become one of the most influential political systems in human history, and its greatest legacy would survive long after the last Mongol armies disappeared from the battlefield. The Mongol Empire had reached the height of its territorial power, but its greatest challenge was no longer conquest. It was survival. An empire could be built by a single generation of victories. Maintaining that empire required something far more difficult. It required cooperation between rulers who were separated by thousands of miles. It required agreements between different branches of the same family. It required taxation, communication, administration, and a shared understanding of political authority. And above all, it required the descendants of Genghis Khan to continue believing that they belonged to one imperial family. That belief was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The Mongol rulers were no longer living the same kind of life. Some ruled from Chinese palaces, some controlled Persian cities, some lived among the steppe peoples of Central Asia, others governed the enormous territories of the Golden Horde. They spoke different languages, they interacted with different populations, they adopted different religions, and they increasingly developed different political interests. The empire that Genghis Khan had created was slowly becoming a family of rival states. But before that fragmentation became complete, one of the most important questions in Mongol history had to be answered. Who had the right to rule? The Mongol political system placed enormous importance on the descendants of Genghis Khan. Being part of the ruling family gave a prince legitimacy. But there were many princes, and each branch of the family had its own ambitions. This created a problem that would appear again and again throughout Mongol history. A successful conquest could unite the empire. A succession dispute could divide it. The death of one great Khan could trigger years of political conflict. And sometimes, the struggle between Mongol rulers became more dangerous than the enemies outside the empire. Kublai Khan understood this better than almost anyone. His position was complicated. He was the ruler of China. He was a Mongol Khan, and he wanted to be recognized as the supreme authority over the entire Mongol world. But other Mongol rulers did not always accept that claim. In the western parts of the empire, political realities were becoming increasingly independent of the Yuan court. The Golden Horde had developed its own powerful leadership. The Chagatai Khanate followed its own interests. The Ilkhanate in Persia was separated from the imperial center by enormous distances. The old unity was fading, yet Kublai continued to present himself as the great Khan. His court in China became one of the most sophisticated centers of Mongol power, and his rule demonstrated something that would become increasingly important. The Mongols were no longer simply conquering civilizations, they were becoming part of them. Kublai's government adopted many Chinese institutions. Chinese bureaucratic traditions were used to administer the population. Taxes were collected through established systems. Officials governed cities and provinces. Agriculture received attention because the Yuan state depended on the enormous productive capacity of China. This created tension. Some Mongols believed that the old steppe traditions were being weakened. Others understood that ruling China required adaptation. Kublai had to balance two identities. He was the descendant of Genghis Khan, but he was also the emperor of China. The solution was the Yuan Dynasty. In 1271, Kublai formally proclaimed the dynasty under the name Yuan. This was more than a change of title. It represented a new political reality. The Mongols had created a Chinese imperial dynasty. The descendants of nomadic warriors now claimed the same kind of universal imperial authority that earlier Chinese dynasties had claimed. But becoming emperor of China did not erase Mongol identity. The Mongol ruling class remained distinct. Different groups received different levels of privilege. The social structure of the Yuan state reflected both Mongol traditions and Chinese institutions. This could create resentment among the Chinese population. The Mongols were foreign rulers, and even when they adopted Chinese practices, they did not simply become Chinese. They remained a ruling elite with their own traditions and interests. Kublai's government also faced enormous financial demands. The empire required armies. The court was expensive. Infrastructure projects required resources. Military campaigns were costly. And the Mongols continued to look beyond China. Kublai's ambitions were not limited to the mainland. He wanted recognition of Mongol authority from neighboring states. This led to military campaigns beyond China. Some were successful. Others ended disastrously. Among the most famous were the attempted invasions of Japan. The first major invasion came in 1274. Mongol forces crossed the sea with troops from territories under Mongol control. They brought warriors from different ethnic backgrounds. Koreans and Chinese were among those involved. The Mongol forces landed in Japan and initially achieved significant success. Japanese warriors were accustomed to a different style of warfare. The Mongol army used coordinated formations. It employed ranged weapons. It used explosive devices and tactics unfamiliar to many Japanese fighters. The Japanese defenders were shocked by the differences. But the Mongol army faced a problem that no battlefield tactic could easily solve: the sea. The invading forces depended on ships. Their supply lines were vulnerable, and the Japanese resistance did not collapse as quickly as expected. Then the weather changed. A powerful storm struck. The Mongol fleet suffered heavy losses. The invasion failed. Years later, Kublai tried again. The second invasion was much larger. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors were mobilized across a vast logistical network. The scale of the operation demonstrated the enormous resources available to the Yuan state. But again, the Japanese resisted. And again, the sea became decisive. A massive storm struck the invasion fleet. Ships were destroyed. Thousands of soldiers drowned. The Mongol invasion collapsed. The Japanese would later associate these storms with divine protection. The term kamikaze, meaning divine wind, became connected with the events. For the Mongol Empire, however, the consequences were practical. The campaigns had consumed enormous resources without producing conquest. Japan remained outside Mongol control, and Kublai's government was beginning to face financial pressure. The same problem appeared elsewhere. Mongol rulers had extraordinary military power, but military power was expensive. Armies had to be fed. Horses had to be maintained. Weapons had to be produced. Roads and communication networks had to be supported. Officials had to be paid. Cities had to be governed. And a huge empire could become expensive even when it was not fighting a major war. The Mongols therefore relied increasingly on taxation. In China, this could be deeply unpopular. The Yuan government inherited an enormous agricultural economy, but natural disasters could devastate crops. Floods could destroy farmland. Drought could create famine. Epidemics could reduce populations. When taxes remained high during difficult years, resentment grew. The Mongols had conquered China, but they had not conquered nature, and nature would become one of their greatest enemies. Still, during Kublai's reign, the Yuan Dynasty remained powerful. The capital became a major center of international exchange. Merchants arrived from distant regions. Diplomats traveled across Asia. Religious figures appeared at the imperial court. Scholars, engineers, doctors, astronomers, and artisans could find opportunities within the enormous Mongol world. The court itself became a place where cultures met. Persian influence existed alongside Chinese traditions. Central Asian merchants interacted with Chinese officials. Mongol aristocrats encountered Buddhist, Taoist, Christian, and Muslim communities. This diversity was one of the most fascinating aspects of the Mongol imperial system. The Mongols were not uniformly committed to a single religion. Different rulers followed different traditions. Shamanic practices remained important. Buddhism became influential, especially in the Yuan court. Islam flourished in many parts of the empire. Christian communities existed across Eurasia. Taoism and Confucian traditions remained deeply important in China. Mongol rulers could sometimes patronize multiple religions simultaneously. This did not mean the empire was perfectly tolerant in every circumstance. Political loyalty always mattered. Religious institutions could become involved in power struggles. Policies could change from one ruler to another. But compared with many medieval states, the Mongol rulers often showed remarkable flexibility toward different faiths. They could employ people from different religious backgrounds. They could invite religious leaders to court. They could allow communities to maintain their own traditions. This religious diversity helped the Mongol Empire function across enormous cultural distances. A Persian Muslim administrator could serve a Mongol ruler. A Chinese Buddhist could work within the Yuan state. A Christian traveller could visit the Mongol court. A Central Asian merchant could conduct business across territories controlled by different branches of the empire. The Mongol world was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan. But the political unity of that world was weakening. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had developed its own identity. Its rulers had inherited the territory conquered by Hulagu. At first, the Ilkhanate remained closely connected to the wider Mongol imperial family, but relations with other branches became complicated. The Ilkhanate fought with the Mamluks. It also faced rivalry with the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde controlled vast territories north of the Black Sea. Its rulers had their own interests. The relationship between the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate became especially tense because of disputes over territory and influence. The Mongol civil conflicts demonstrated an uncomfortable truth. The empire's greatest weakness was becoming its own size. When Genghis Khan's armies were expanding, distance could be overcome by victory. But once rival Mongol rulers controlled different regions, distance became a source of independence. A ruler in Persia could make decisions without waiting for China. A ruler in the Golden Horde could pursue policies that benefited his own territory. A ruler in Central Asia could challenge another branch of the family. The empire still existed in the imagination of its rulers, but politically, it was becoming a network of connected states rather than one unified command. This process was accelerated by religious and cultural changes. The Mongol rulers gradually adopted the religions of the populations they governed. In Persia and the Golden Horde, Islam became increasingly important. In the Yuan realm, Tibetan Buddhism gained influence at the imperial court. Different branches of the family, therefore, began to identify themselves with different cultural worlds. This did not erase their Mongol heritage, but it changed their priorities. The Golden Horde became deeply connected to the Islamic world. The Ilkhanate eventually became an Islamic state. The Yuan Dynasty increasingly adopted Chinese imperial traditions. The Chagatai lands developed their own Central Asian identity. The descendants of Genghis Khan were becoming rulers of different civilizations, and the empire that had once moved as one began moving in different directions. Still, the Mongol legacy continued to spread. One of the most important areas affected by Mongol rule was Russia. The Mongol conquest of the Rus lands had been devastating. But after the initial destruction, the Mongols established a system of tribute. The princes of the Rus were allowed to rule their territories under Mongol authority. They paid taxes and tribute. They received recognition from the Khan. This arrangement lasted for generations. Moscow gradually emerged as one of the most important centers within the Rus world. Its rulers learned to operate within the Mongol political system. They collected tribute. They developed administrative institutions. They built relationships with the Khans. And over time, Moscow became increasingly powerful. This is one of history's great ironies. The Mongol conquest weakened many existing political centers, but it also helped create conditions in which Moscow could eventually rise. The Mongol period in Russia, therefore, cannot simply be described as a period of destruction. It was also a period of political transformation. The princes of Moscow learned how to navigate the politics of the Golden Horde. They became skilled at taxation and administration. They developed stronger, centralized authority. And centuries later, Moscow would become the center of a powerful Russian state. The Mongol influence was therefore indirect as well as direct. Empires often leave behind consequences that their founders could never have predicted. The Mongols wanted tribute. They wanted obedience. They wanted political control. They were not deliberately trying to create the future Russian state. Yet their conquest helped reshape the political environment from which that state eventually emerged. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. In China, Mongol rule created new relationships between East Asia and the wider Eurasian world. In Persia, Mongol rule transformed political institutions and cultural exchange. In Central Asia, Mongol elites gradually became part of the societies they governed. Across the steppe, new political identities emerged. The Mongol Empire was disappearing as a unified political entity, but its effects were spreading. This is why the fall of the Mongol Empire cannot be described as a single event. There was no one day when the empire simply vanished. Instead, different parts declined at different times. Some states survived for generations. Others collapsed quickly. The Yuan Dynasty in China would eventually fall. The Ilkhanate would disappear. The Chagatai world would fragment and transform. The Golden Horde would survive much longer than many of its rivals. The Mongol political world was not ending. It was changing. And in China, the signs of crisis were becoming impossible to ignore. Kublai Khan died in 1294. His successors lacked his authority. They faced financial problems. Court factions competed for power. The bureaucracy became increasingly difficult to control. Natural disasters struck. Floods along the Yellow River devastated agricultural regions. Famine followed. Epidemics spread. The government's ability to respond weakened. For ordinary people, the legitimacy of the Yuan dynasty began to decline. The Mongols had once seemed unstoppable. Now they were struggling to maintain control over the territory they had conquered. Rebellions began. One movement after another challenged Yuan authority. Among them was a man who would rise from a difficult background and eventually establish a new Chinese dynasty. His name was Zhu Yanzhang. He had experienced poverty. He had lived through famine and political chaos. He eventually joined a rebel movement. Through military skill, political intelligence, and careful organization, he rose to become its leader. In 1368, Zhu Yanzhang established the Ming dynasty. The Mongol rulers were driven from the Chinese heartland. The Yuan dynasty had fallen. The Mongols retreated north. The dynasty founded by Kublai Khan was gone from China. But the Mongol political tradition did not disappear. The northern Yuan continued to exist in Mongolia. The descendants of Genghis Khan remained important, and the memory of Mongol rule remained deeply embedded in Chinese history. The rise and fall of the Yuan dynasty demonstrated the fundamental difficulty of ruling a civilization as enormous as China. Conquest could be achieved by military power. Legitimacy required something else. It required stable administration. It required economic stability. It required political cooperation. And it required the population to accept the ruling system. The Mongols had been extraordinarily successful at the first task. They had conquered China. But maintaining that conquest for generations proved much more difficult. Meanwhile, farther west, the political descendants of Genghis Khan were experiencing their own transformations. The Ilkhanate had changed dramatically. Its rulers increasingly adopted Islam. The Mongol ruling class became integrated into Persian political culture. The language of administration remained diverse. Persian scholars continued their work. Cities recovered. Trade continued. The Mongol period in Persia, therefore, became a strange combination of destruction and reconstruction. The initial conquest had been catastrophic, but later rulers invested in administration, architecture, agriculture, and scholarship. The Mongols could be destructive conquerors and constructive rulers at different points in their history. This contradiction appears again and again. It is one reason their legacy remains so difficult to interpret. In Central Asia, another important transformation was underway. The Mongol elite gradually became part of the Turkic and Islamic world. Languages changed, cultures mixed, new political identities emerged. The descendants of Mongol rulers would eventually play roles in the rise of later Central Asian empires. The Mongol legacy did not disappear, it changed shape. And perhaps nowhere was this more important than in the world of the steppe. The steppe had always been a zone of movement. Tribes rose, tribes fell, political alliances shifted, empires appeared and disappeared. The Mongols had taken this tradition and expanded it to an unprecedented scale. But once their empire fragmented, other powers inherited the same geopolitical space. New khanates emerged. Old Mongol territories continued to be contested. The descendants of Genghis Khan remained politically important for centuries. His name carried legitimacy. In many parts of Eurasia, rulers could strengthen their claims to authority by tracing their ancestry back to the Mongol imperial family. The bloodline of Genghis Khan became a political asset. The empire had fragmented, but the prestige of its founder survived. And then there was the most enduring legacy of all, the connections. Before the Mongol conquests, Eurasia was already connected through trade. The Silk Roads were ancient. Merchants had crossed Central Asia for centuries. Civilizations had interacted long before Genghis Khan. But Mongol rule altered the scale and security of those connections. For a period, huge territories were governed by related Mongol states. Trade routes became more integrated. Merchants could travel farther. Information moved faster. Technologies crossed cultural boundaries. Gunpowder knowledge moved between regions. Papermaking spread. Cartographic knowledge expanded. Astronomical ideas travelled. Medical knowledge crossed borders. And people who would otherwise have remained separated encountered one another. This was the great paradox of the Mongol Empire. Its armies had created separation through destruction, but its political network also created connection. The same empire could produce both devastation and exchange, and the effects of that exchange would continue long after Mongol political power declined. European travellers began hearing stories of distant lands. Asian goods reached European markets. Diplomatic contacts increased. The geographic imagination of Eurasia expanded. People began to understand that the world beyond their own region was larger, wealthier, and more interconnected than they had previously imagined. The Mongol Empire had changed how Eurasia experienced distance. Distance was still enormous. Mountains remained mountains. Deserts remained deserts. Oceans remained dangerous. But political control had created corridors through which people could move, and that changed history. Yet the same networks carried something else: disease. In the 14th century, the Black Death spread across Eurasia. The origins of the plague were complex. Its movement involved ecological, commercial, and human factors. But the interconnected trade networks of the Mongol world played an important role in creating pathways through which disease could travel. The plague devastated populations. Cities lost enormous numbers of inhabitants. Agricultural production declined. Labor became scarce. Economic systems were disrupted. Political structures weakened. The consequences were enormous. The Mongol Empire had helped create a connected Eurasian world. Now that connected world was experiencing one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in recorded history. The lesson was brutal. Connection creates opportunity, but connection also creates vulnerability. And the Mongol period had made Eurasia more connected than ever. As the 14th century progressed, Mongol power continued to decline in many regions. But the world they had created did not simply return to what it had been before. The political map had changed. The trade routes had changed. The populations had changed. The ruling elites had changed. And the memory of Mongol rule remained embedded in the civilizations they had conquered. The Mongol Empire was disappearing, but its shadow was becoming permanent. And the story was not finished. Because after the great empire of Genghis Khan fragmented, another extraordinary figure would rise from the Mongol political world. He would claim descent from the Mongol ruling tradition. He would conquer enormous territories, and he would build an empire of his own. His name was Timur. And although he was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, he understood the power of Mongol legitimacy. He would use it to build one of the most formidable states of the late medieval world. The age of the Mongols was changing, but the political traditions created on the steppe were far from dead. The world of Genghis Khan had not vanished. It had evolved, and its next chapter would lead us into a Eurasia where Mongol descendants, Turkic rulers, Islamic states, Chinese dynasties, and emerging European powers would compete for control of the same vast spaces once dominated by the Great Khan. The empire had fractured, but history had inherited its pieces. By the beginning of the 15th century, the political world created by the Mongols had become almost unrecognizable compared with the empire of Genghis Khan. The enormous unified state had disappeared. But the territories once controlled by the Mongols remained connected through memory, trade, political traditions, and the descendants of the ruling family. The Mongol Empire had fragmented. Its legacy had not. And one of the most powerful men to emerge from this changing world was Timur. In the West, he would become known as Tamerlane. He was born in Central Asia in the 14th century, in a region where Mongol and Turkic traditions had become deeply intertwined. Timur was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. That presented a problem. In the political culture of Central Asia, descent from Genghis Khan carried enormous legitimacy. Timur therefore needed another way to present himself as a legitimate ruler. He married into the Chinggisid family. He placed members of the Genghisid line in symbolic positions. And he ruled as a powerful military leader whose authority was supported by both conquest and political tradition. Timur understood the world he had inherited. He understood the power of the Mongol military system. He understood the importance of mobility. He understood the value of intelligence. And he understood the psychological impact of fear. His campaigns would eventually stretch from Central Asia to Persia, the Caucasus, India, and the Middle East. Like Genghis Khan, Timur could be extraordinarily brutal. Cities that resisted could face catastrophic punishment. Populations could be massacred. Survivors could be deported. Skilled craftsmen could be transported to his capital. But there was an important difference between Timur and the original Mongol expansion. Timur was operating in a world already transformed by the Mongols. The political structures of Central Asia had been shaped by centuries of Mongol rule. The military traditions of the steppe remained powerful. The trade routes remained important. The old Mongol imperial idea still carried prestige. Timur exploited all of it. His armies moved rapidly. His commanders used deception. His campaigns relied on carefully coordinated cavalry, and his enemies often struggled to predict where he would strike next. In Persia, Timur conquered major territories. In India, he invaded the Delhi Sultanate. In 1398, his forces entered northern India. Delhi was captured. The city suffered enormous destruction. Timur's campaign demonstrated that the military traditions of the steppe had not disappeared with the decline of the Mongol Empire. They had evolved. And the influence of the Mongol world continued through new conquerors. Yet Timur was not simply a destroyer. He also wanted to create a magnificent capital. Samarkand became the center of his empire. He transformed the city into a monumental capital. Architects and craftsmen from conquered territories were brought to Samarkand. Buildings were constructed. Mosques, schools, gardens, and monumental structures reshaped the city. Timur's empire therefore produced the same paradox that had characterized Mongol rule. Conquest brought destruction, but conquest also moved people, skills, technology, and artistic traditions across enormous distances. A craftsman from one city might find himself working hundreds or thousands of miles away. A scholar could move to a new court. An architect could carry architectural ideas across regions. The movement of people created cultural exchange, and Samarkand became one of the most spectacular centers of that exchange. After Timur's death in 1405, his empire fragmented, but his descendants established a cultural tradition that would become extremely important. The Timurid rulers became patrons of science, literature, architecture, and art. One of the most remarkable figures was Ulugh Beg. He was Timur's grandson. Unlike his grandfather, Ulugh Beg became famous not primarily as a conqueror, but as a scholar and astronomer. In Samarkand, he established an observatory. Astronomers studied the stars. Mathematical calculations were performed. Tables of astronomical positions were produced with remarkable precision for the period. This was one of the unexpected consequences of the political world created by the Mongol and Timurid conquests. The steppe military tradition had helped create vast networks. Those networks moved people and knowledge, and eventually, rulers who inherited those networks could become patrons of science. The Mongol legacy was therefore not limited to warfare. It could also contribute to intellectual exchange. But while Central Asia was experiencing these transformations, another power was rising farther west: the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were not Mongols, but they emerged in a Eurasian political world deeply shaped by the collapse of earlier empires. the decline of the Byzantine Empire, the fragmentation of the Seljuk world, the changing political landscape of Anatolia, and the movement of Turkic peoples across Central and Western Asia. The Mongol invasions had contributed to these transformations. The Mongol defeat of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had weakened one of the major powers of Anatolia. The political fragmentation that followed created opportunities for new states. Among them was the Ottoman Principality. Over the next several centuries, the Ottomans would become one of the greatest empires in world history. They would eventually conquer Constantinople. They would control the Eastern Mediterranean. They would dominate large parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. And they would inherit many of the political spaces once transformed by Mongol expansion. The Mongol Empire had therefore helped reshape the world in which later empires emerged. But perhaps the most important long-term transformation occurred in the movement of knowledge between East and West. The medieval world had never been isolated, but Mongol rule accelerated exchange. European travelers encountered Asian goods and technologies. Chinese technologies became known farther west. Paper and printing traditions moved across cultural boundaries. Gunpowder technology spread. Navigation knowledge expanded. Medical and astronomical ideas crossed regions, and merchants learned more about distant markets. The Mongol Empire did not invent all of these exchanges. Many had existed for centuries, but Mongol political control created a period in which enormous portions of Eurasia were connected through related states. This made the movement easier and, in some cases, safer. The consequences eventually reached Europe. European rulers became increasingly interested in Asia. Merchants wanted access to Eastern markets. Christian missionaries traveled toward Mongol territories. Diplomats sought alliances. Travelers wrote about distant civilizations. The European imagination expanded, and over time, European powers began searching for alternative routes to Asia. This would eventually contribute to one of the greatest transformations in world history, the Age of Exploration. Centuries after Genghis Khan, European ships would sail into oceans that had previously separated civilizations. They would seek routes to Asia. They would establish colonies. They would build maritime empires, and the world would become connected on an even larger scale. The Mongol Empire was not responsible for the Age of Exploration, but the Eurasian connections strengthened during Mongol rule were part of the broader historical process that made Europeans increasingly aware of Asia's wealth and complexity. The desire to reach the East did not begin with the Mongols, but the Mongol world helped make the East more visible, and this visibility had consequences. One of the most famous travelers of the medieval period was Ibn Battuta. His journeys carried him across much of the Islamic world and beyond. He traveled through regions that had been profoundly transformed by Mongol rule. He encountered political systems descended from or influenced by the Mongol period. His travels demonstrated how connected the Islamic world and Eurasian trade networks had become. Another famous traveler was Rabban Bar Soma. Unlike Marco Polo, he traveled from East Asia toward Europe. He was a Christian monk from the Mongol world who eventually reached European courts. His journey is a reminder that movement across Eurasia did not only happen from west to east. People traveled in both directions. The Mongol world was a crossroads, and crossroads create stories. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, diplomats, scholars, refugees, missionaries, adventurers, all could move through the same vast network. Some traveled willingly, others were forced. The movement of populations was one of the darker consequences of Mongol conquest. Cities could be depopulated, skilled workers could be relocated, captives could be transported thousands of miles, entire communities could be displaced. The Mongol Empire moved people on a scale that could transform local societies. This was both a source of cultural exchange and a source of trauma. A city might lose its craftsmen. Another city might suddenly gain them. A region could acquire new technologies. Another could lose generations of knowledge. The empire constantly redistributed human talent. This is one reason why the Mongol period cannot be understood simply through maps. Maps show territory. They do not show people. They do not show the families separated by conquest. They do not show the artisans transported to distant capitals. They do not show the merchants who suddenly found new markets. They do not show the refugees who fled destroyed cities. They do not show the children born into a world where Mongol rule was simply the normal political reality. History happened to people, and the Mongol Empire changed the lives of millions. Some benefited, some suffered. Most experienced both direct and indirect consequences. For farmers, the effects could depend on region. A campaign might destroy crops. Another government might later restore irrigation. A city might be destroyed and eventually rebuilt. A trade route might become safer. Taxes might increase. Security might improve. Life under Mongol rule was not the same everywhere. It varied enormously. This is why broad statements about the Mongols can be misleading. They were not one government behaving identically across every region. The empire was decentralized. Different rulers adopted different policies. Local administrators had enormous influence. The relationship between conquerors and conquered changed over time. A city could be devastated during conquest and become prosperous generations later. A population could initially resist and eventually become integrated into the imperial system. A Mongol ruling family could adopt the religion and language of its subjects. The empire was constantly changing. This adaptability was one of its greatest strengths. It was also one of the reasons it eventually ceased to be recognizably Mongol. The conquerors became part of the conquered world. In Persia, Mongol rulers became Persianized and Islamic. In China, the Mongol elite adopted Chinese imperial institutions. In the Golden Horde, Mongol rulers became deeply connected with Turkic and Islamic cultures. In Central Asia, Mongol and Turkic identities merged. The people who inherited Genghis Khan's empire were becoming different from the people who had originally conquered it. This process is sometimes described as assimilation, but assimilation is not quite enough. It was mutual transformation. The Mongols changed the societies they ruled. Those societies changed the Mongols. The result was something new. New languages, new political identities, new cultures, new dynasties, new trade patterns. The Mongol Empire had begun as a steppe conquest. It ended as a world-changing cultural transformation, but the political collapse of the empire continued. The Golden Horde eventually weakened. Internal disputes increased. Rival princes competed. New powers emerged. Moscow grew stronger. The Crimean Khanate became independent. Other successor states appeared across the steppe. By the 15th century, the political world of the Mongols had become fragmented into numerous khanates and regional powers. Yet one important institution remained: the idea of Chinggisid legitimacy. In many steppe societies, rulers who could claim descent from Genghis Khan possessed enormous symbolic authority. Even powerful leaders who were not descended from him sometimes needed Chinggisid princes to legitimize their rule. This created an unusual political structure. A man could possess the army. Another could possess the bloodline. Political power could therefore depend on cooperation between military leaders and Chinggisid descendants. The Mongol imperial family remained politically relevant long after the empire itself had disappeared. In the Russian world, the memory of Mongol rule lasted for centuries. The term Tatar became associated with many of the peoples of the steppe. Russian rulers gradually rejected Golden Horde authority, but they also inherited administrative and political practices shaped during the period of Mongol domination. The eventual rise of the Russian state would be influenced by this history. In China, the Ming dynasty replaced the Yuan. The Chinese state returned to native dynastic rule. But the northern frontier remained closely connected to the Mongol world. The Ming built enormous defensive structures. The Great Wall system was expanded and reinforced. Relations between China and the Mongol successor states remained a major geopolitical issue. The Mongols had been pushed out of China, but China could not simply forget them. They remained beyond the frontier, and the northern frontier would remain a source of military tension for centuries. In Central Asia, the legacy of Genghis Khan continued through the political culture of the steppe. Later rulers invoked his name. His descendants remained important. and the memory of the great empire remained embedded in oral traditions and political claims. The Mongol story therefore continued long after the formal empire ended. But if the political empire was gone, what remained? Perhaps the simplest answer is this: a changed world. Before Genghis Khan, Eurasia was already connected. After Genghis Khan, the connections were different. The political map was different. The movement of people was different. The relationship of power was different. The relationship between China, Central Asia, Persia, Russia, and Europe was different. And the memory of the steppe conquerors influenced rulers for generations. The Mongol Empire had become a historical force larger than the people who created it. This is why historians continue to debate Genghis Khan. Was he a genius? A tyrant? A state builder? A destroyer? A visionary? A brutal opportunist? The answer depends partly on where you stand. If you were living in a city destroyed by his army, the answer would be obvious. If you were a merchant traveling safely across a newly connected trade route, the answer might be very different. If you were a scholar whose work was supported by a Mongol court, your memory might not resemble that of a conquered farmer. History contains all of these perspectives, and the Mongol Empire forces us to confront that complexity. Its violence was real. Its destruction was real. Its achievements were real. Its cultural exchange was real. Its political innovations were real. Its legacy was enormous. One of the most important myths about the Mongols is that they simply appeared from nowhere, conquered everything, and then disappeared. The reality is much more interesting. They emerged from a complex steppe society. They built alliances. They fought rivals. They learned from conquered peoples. They created institutions. They adapted to different civilizations. They fragmented. They transformed. And eventually, their descendants became part of the societies they had conquered. The Mongols did not simply conquer Eurasia. Eurasia changed them. That may be the deepest lesson of their history. Genghis Khan began with the steppe. He ended up creating a world in which the steppe was connected to almost every major civilization across Eurasia, and that connection would outlive him by centuries. But there is another part of the story that is often overlooked: the Mongol military system itself. What made their armies so effective? Why could relatively small forces defeat much larger armies? How did horse archers defeat fortified states? How could Mongol commanders coordinate forces across enormous distances? The answer begins with discipline. The Mongol army was not simply a mass of mounted warriors. It was organized. Units were structured. Commands were clear. Communication was essential. Training began early. Archery was practiced constantly. Riders learned to control horses with remarkable precision. The bow was central. Mongol composite bows were powerful and compact. They could be used from horseback. Warriors carried multiple bows and large numbers of arrows. They could fire while moving. They could turn their horses quickly. They could shoot in different directions. And because the army depended on mobility, Mongol warriors often carried relatively light equipment. They were not burdened with the heavy armor common in some other medieval armies. This allowed them to travel quickly. The Mongol horse itself was also crucial. Steppe horses were smaller than many European war horses, but they were hardy. They could survive harsh conditions. They could forage. A Mongol warrior could maintain several horses. During long campaigns, mounts could be changed. This allowed armies to travel great distances without exhausting a single animal. Mobility created operational flexibility. A Mongol army could appear somewhere unexpected. It could split into multiple forces. Each force could operate independently. Then they could reunite. This made Mongol campaigns difficult to predict. Commanders like Chagatai were masters of this system. Chagatai could coordinate multiple armies over vast distances. He understood intelligence. He understood terrain. He understood enemy psychology. He often used feigned retreats. He could lure opponents away from defensive positions. He could attack from unexpected directions. He could coordinate forces that were separated by hundreds of miles. This level of operational planning was extraordinary for the medieval period. But the Mongols also understood logistics. This may be one of the least appreciated aspects of their success. An army cannot fight without food. It cannot move without horses. It cannot communicate without messengers. It cannot maintain weapons without supplies. The Mongols developed systems suited to the steppe. They traveled with herds. They used local resources. They relied on captured supplies. They adapted to the environment. When they entered agricultural regions, they used the resources of those regions. When they faced deserts, they planned around water. When they faced mountains, they used local guides. When they faced rivers, they built bridges or boats. When they faced fortifications, they recruited engineers. Their flexibility was a weapon. And perhaps most importantly, they were willing to learn. Every conquered civilization had something useful. The Mongols understood that. They did not need to invent everything themselves. They needed to identify what worked. Then they needed to use it. This mentality allowed a society that originated in the steppe to become capable of fighting almost anywhere. They could fight cavalry armies. They could fight infantry. They could conduct sieges. They could fight in deserts. They could operate in forests. They could cross rivers. They could use naval forces. The Mongol military system was therefore not static. It evolved with every conquest. And this adaptability made the empire extraordinarily dangerous. But it also contained the seeds of a future problem. The more the Mongols conquered, the more they depended on conquered peoples. The empire became less purely Mongolian. Its soldiers came from many backgrounds. Its administrators came from many cultures. Its armies became multinational. Its cities became cosmopolitan. Its rulers adopted local customs. The Mongol Empire was becoming something larger than the original Mongol nation. That was its greatest strength, and eventually its greatest weakness. Because once the descendants of Genghis Khan became rulers of different civilizations, there was no single Mongol identity strong enough to hold them all together forever. The empire had conquered distance, but it could not permanently conquer political ambition. Eventually, every branch wanted its own power. Every ruler wanted security. Every region developed its own interests. And the empire that had once expanded as one force became a collection of competing worlds. Still, for a brief period in history, something extraordinary had existed. A political system stretching across much of Eurasia, a network connecting China with Persia, Persia with Russia, Russia with Central Asia, Central Asia with China. And through trade, diplomacy, and travel, all of these worlds with Europe. The Mongol Empire had created a Eurasian system on a scale that had rarely existed before. And even after it fragmented, the memory of that connected world remained. The roads remained, the cities remained, the descendants remained, the stories remained, and above all, the idea remained that a power from the distant steppe could rise and reshape the world. The age of the great Mongol conquests had ended, but the world created by those conquests was still moving. Across Eurasia, new states were rising from the ruins of older ones. The Mongol Empire had fragmented, but its political traditions, military techniques, trade networks, and ruling families continued to shape the future. In China, the Ming Dynasty had replaced the Yuan. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had disappeared. In Central Asia, the Timurid world was emerging. In Russia, Moscow was becoming increasingly powerful. And across the steppe, the descendants of Genghis Khan continued to claim authority. The map had changed, but the Mongol story had not truly ended. In many ways, it had entered its most influential phase, because now the Mongol legacy was no longer controlled by a single empire. It had been absorbed into the political systems of many different civilizations. The Mongols had become part of the world they had conquered, and nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in China. The Ming dynasty had driven the Mongols north, but the northern frontier remained dangerous. The Mongols regrouped beyond the Great Wall. Different Mongol leaders continued to fight one another. Some attempted to restore the power of the Yuan. Others competed for control of the steppe. The Ming rulers understood that the Mongols could return, so the northern frontier became one of the most important strategic concerns of the Chinese state. Fortifications were strengthened. Garrisons were established. Military settlements were developed. The Great Wall system was expanded over generations. The image of the Great Wall is often associated with ancient China, but much of the structure that survives today was built or rebuilt during the Ming period, long after Genghis Khan. Its purpose was not simply to stop one army. It was part of a much larger frontier system. Watchtowers, fortresses, roads, garrisons, signal systems. Together, they created a defensive network. The Ming rulers understood that the Mongols could not be defeated simply by building one wall. The steppe was too large. The frontier was too long. Mongol cavalry could move around fixed obstacles, so the Ming developed a combination of defensive and offensive strategies. Sometimes they negotiated. Sometimes they traded. Sometimes they launched military campaigns. Sometimes they attempted to place favorable Mongol leaders in positions of power. The relationship between China and the Mongol world therefore remained complicated. It was not simply a permanent war. There were periods of conflict. There were periods of trade. There were diplomatic missions. There were marriages. There were negotiations. The frontier was constantly changing. This was another legacy of the Mongol period. China could no longer ignore the steppe. The steppe could not ignore China. The two worlds were permanently connected. Farther west, another major transformation was taking place. The descendants of the Golden Horde were dividing into new political entities. One of the most important was the Crimean Khanate. It emerged in the 15th century and became closely connected with the Ottoman Empire. Its rulers claimed descent from Genghis Khan. That claim gave them political legitimacy. The Crimean Khans controlled territory around the Black Sea and played a major role in the politics of Eastern Europe. They fought neighboring states. They raided territories. They traded. They negotiated. And they maintained the political traditions of the old Mongol steppe. The Golden Horde itself gradually weakened. Rival Khans competed for power. Internal divisions increased. Moscow grew stronger. Lithuania and Poland expanded their influence. The political balance of Eastern Europe was changing. The old Mongol domination was fading, but it did not disappear overnight. For generations, Moscow had operated within the political world of the Golden Horde. Its rulers had learned how to negotiate with the Khans. They had paid tribute. They had received permission to rule. They had sometimes competed with other princes for favor. This experience helped Moscow develop a more centralized political system. Over time, the Moscow princes began to challenge the authority of the Golden Horde. One of the symbolic turning points came in 1480. Ivan III refused to continue paying tribute. The forces of Moscow and the Great Horde faced one another at the Ugra River. The confrontation did not produce a massive battle. Instead, the armies eventually withdrew, but the political meaning was enormous. Moscow had effectively rejected Mongol authority. The long period of Golden Horde domination over the Russian lands was coming to an end. Yet the influence of that period remained. Moscow had developed within the political environment created by Mongol rule. The administrative habits, taxation systems, diplomatic practices, and political culture of the previous centuries had shaped the rising Russian state. The Mongol period had therefore become part of Russian history, and the future Russian Empire would eventually expand across the same steppe that had once carried Mongol armies westward. The direction of power was changing. The descendants of the Mongols were losing territory. The Russian state was gaining it. Over the next several centuries, Russia would expand across Siberia. Russian explorers, soldiers, merchants, and settlers would move east. They would cross enormous distances. They would encounter steppe peoples, forest communities, and societies that had long been part of the wider Eurasian world. Eventually, Russian territory would reach the Pacific Ocean. The irony is striking. The Mongols had once used the steppe as a highway to the west. Later, Russia would use the same geographical space to expand toward the east. The steppe remained a corridor of empire. The empire had simply changed hands. In Central Asia, however, the Mongol legacy remained much more visible. The Timurid rulers had inherited many traditions from the Mongol political world. They promoted scholarship. They supported architecture. They competed for territory, they relied on cavalry, and they maintained links with the wider Islamic world. Samarkand became famous for its monumental architecture. The blue domes and enormous structures that emerged during the Timurid period reflected a synthesis of Central Asian, Persian, and Islamic traditions. The city became a center of learning. Astronomy flourished. Mathematics developed. Literature received royal patronage. The descendants of Timur would eventually spread these traditions far beyond Central Asia. Babur was one of them. He was born into a world of political instability. His family had lost control of important Central Asian territories. He struggled to establish himself. At times, he controlled cities. At other times, he was forced to flee. His early life was marked by uncertainty. But eventually, Babur looked south. India offered enormous opportunities. The subcontinent was wealthy. Its political landscape was divided. Powerful kingdoms competed with one another. Babur saw an opening. In 1526, he faced the forces of the Delhi Sultanate at the First Battle of Panipat. His army was smaller, but his tactics and artillery gave him an advantage. He used field fortifications, he used firearms, he used coordinated cavalry, and he defeated a much larger force. The victory opened the way for the Mughal Empire. Babur had established a dynasty that would rule much of India for generations. The Mughal Empire is one of the clearest examples of how far the legacy of the Mongol world travelled. The Mughal rulers were descendants of Timur. They also claimed descent from Genghis Khan. Their political culture was deeply influenced by Central Asia. Their court language was Persian. Their armies included cavalry traditions inherited from the steppe. But they ruled India, and India transformed them. The Mughal Empire became a unique synthesis: Central Asian heritage, Persian culture, Islamic political traditions, Indian architecture, South Asian administration, local military systems. The result was one of the great civilizations of early modern history. Under Akbar, the Mughal Empire expanded dramatically. Akbar understood that ruling India required more than military victory. He needed cooperation from different communities. He developed administrative systems. He reorganized taxation. He incorporated local elites. He created alliances. He encouraged cultural exchange. The Mughal state became more than a foreign conquest. It became an Indian empire with Central Asian roots. Again, the pattern repeated. The conquerors were transformed by the civilization they conquered. This had happened to the Mongols in China. It had happened to the Mongols in Persia. Now it was happening to their distant descendants in India. The legacy of the steppe was spreading through adaptation, not through one empire, but through generations of rulers who carried political traditions into new environments. Meanwhile, Europe was undergoing enormous changes. The medieval world was becoming the early modern world. Gunpowder weapons were transforming warfare. Centralized monarchies were becoming stronger. Printing was spreading. Maritime exploration was expanding, and the Ottoman Empire was becoming one of the most powerful states on earth. The Ottomans had conquered Constantinople in 1453. The Byzantine Empire had ended. The Ottoman state became a major bridge between Europe and Asia. It controlled territories across Anatolia, southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Its rulers were not descendants of Genghis Khan, but they were operating in a geopolitical world deeply shaped by the Mongol period. Central Asia remained strategically important. The Black Sea remained a major trade zone. Persia remained a powerful rival. The Caucasus remained contested. The Ottoman Empire inherited a world in which the old Mongol political structures had already transformed the relationships between these regions. And now the Ottomans would compete with another great empire, the Safavids of Persia. The Safavid dynasty emerged in the early 16th century. It established Shia Islam as the dominant religious tradition of Iran. This transformed the political and religious landscape of the Middle East. The Ottomans were predominantly Sunni. The Safavids were Shia. Their rivalry was both political and religious. And once again, Central Asia and the old Mongol world stood between major civilizations. Trade routes crossed the region. Armies moved through it. Cities became centers of power. The The political map of Eurasia was being rebuilt. The Mongol Empire had disappeared, but the geography it had once dominated remained one of the most important geopolitical spaces in the world. This is an important point. Empires do not simply leave behind ruins. They leave behind political habits. They leave behind borders. They leave behind populates. They leave behind populations. They leave behind institutions. They leave behind memories. And future rulers inherit all of them. The Mongol Empire was therefore still influencing history centuries after its fragmentation. But perhaps its greatest legacy was something less visible. A change in the scale of human imagination. Before the Mongol conquests, a person living in one region might know little about another region thousands of miles away. After the Mongol period, more people had experienced long-distance travel. More merchants had crossed Eurasia. More diplomats had communicated between distant courts. More scholars had encountered foreign ideas. More travellers had described distant cities. The world had become larger in people's minds, and the map of Eurasia was increasingly understood as one interconnected space. This mattered enormously. Knowledge changes behaviour. Once people know that a wealthy market exists thousands of miles away, they may attempt to reach it. Once rulers know that powerful states exist beyond their borders, they may seek alliances. Once merchants understand that a trade route is possible, they may invest in it. Once scholars encounter foreign knowledge, they may incorporate it into their own work. The Mongol period accelerated these processes. The world did not suddenly become global, but the foundations of a more connected Eurasia became stronger. And then came a new revolution: the oceans. For centuries, the Silk Roads had been among the most important commercial networks in the world. But maritime routes offered something land routes could not. They could bypass some of the political barriers of Central Asia. They could carry enormous quantities of goods. They could connect distant coasts. European powers began to recognize the potential. Portuguese ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope. They entered the Indian Ocean. They reached South Asia. They established trading posts. Spanish expeditions crossed the Atlantic and Pacific. The Dutch and English followed. A new kind of empire was emerging: maritime empire. The center of global trade was slowly shifting. The old overland routes remained important, but the oceans were becoming more powerful. The Mongol era had helped create an interconnected Eurasian world. The maritime age would create an interconnected global world. And this transformation would eventually reshape the balance of power completely. European states that had once been peripheral to the great civilizations of Asia began accumulating wealth through overseas trade. They acquired colonies. They controlled ports. They built naval forces. They extracted resources. The world was entering a new political era, but the Mongol influence remained visible. European explorers were still searching for Asian markets. Asian goods remained enormously desirable: silk, spices, porcelain, precious metals, textiles. The desire to reach Asia had been one of the major motivations behind European exploration. The routes had changed. The destination had not. The East remained the source of extraordinary wealth in the European imagination, and the old stories of the Mongol world had helped shape European knowledge of that East. Travellers had written about China. Merchants had described Central Asia. Missionaries had reported on distant courts. Maps had gradually incorporated new information. The Mongol period had opened windows. The maritime age would open doors. But the connections created by long-distance trade also carried a terrible consequence: disease. The Black Death had already devastated Eurasia in the 14th century. Populations collapsed. Entire communities disappeared. Labour became scarce. Economic systems changed. Political structures weakened. The plague demonstrated the danger of an interconnected world. A disease that might once have remained local could now travel across long-distance trade routes. Merchants could carry infection. Animals could carry infection. Ships could carry infection. And when the disease reached densely populated cities, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Mongol world had connected Eurasia. The plague showed the cost of that connection. Yet the demographic collapse also changed society. In some regions, labor became more valuable. Workers could demand better conditions. Landowners faced shortages. Economic relationships changed. The social order of Europe began to shift. The Black Death did not create the end of medieval Europe by itself, but it accelerated enormous changes, and those changes eventually contributed to the rise of stronger centralized states. The world was moving toward the early modern period. The old feudal structures were changing. Gunpowder warfare was becoming dominant. Professional armies were expanding. Trade was becoming increasingly international, and political authority was becoming more centralized. The Mongol military model had once dominated Eurasia. Now, gunpowder armies were replacing horse archers as the decisive force. This was a major technological transformation. The Mongols had adapted to every military technology they encountered. They had used siege engines. They had adopted Chinese weapons. They had employed engineers. But gunpowder would eventually change warfare at a deeper level. Fortifications became more complex. Cannons became more powerful. Infantry became increasingly important. Cavalry remained useful, but no longer could mobility alone dominate a battlefield. The age of the great horse empires was slowly ending, yet cavalry traditions survived. In Central Asia, mounted warfare remained essential. In the Ottoman world, cavalry continued to play major roles. In the Mughal Empire, cavalry remained extremely important. The transformation was gradual. The old world did not disappear overnight. Instead, old military traditions existed alongside new technologies. The Mongol legacy therefore continued even as the nature of warfare changed. One of the most important examples was the continued importance of mounted archery among steppe peoples. For centuries, horsemen remained powerful, but increasingly, firearms changed the balance. A disciplined infantry force equipped with firearms could eventually challenge traditional cavalry systems. This would become increasingly important in Central Asia. The old steppe military system was entering its final centuries, but its political influence remained. The descendants of Genghis Khan still ruled in several regions. The title of Khan remained powerful. The memory of the great conqueror remained politically useful, and the steppe continued to produce ambitious rulers. One of the most important was the Uzbek leader Muhammad Shaybani Khan. He and his successors would establish a powerful Uzbek political presence in Central Asia. The region became a battlefield between competing dynasties. Timurid rulers, Uzbek rulers, Persian rulers, Mughal rulers. Each claimed territory. Each sought control over trade routes. Each understood the strategic importance of cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Herat. The old Mongol political geography was being rewritten, but the importance of those cities remained. Samarkand remained a symbol. Bukhara became a major center of Islamic scholarship. Herat remained a cultural center. The region continued to connect Iran, India, China, and the steppe. Central Asia was no longer ruled by one empire, but it remained central to Eurasian politics. And that is another reason the Mongol legacy matters. The empire had demonstrated the strategic importance of Central Asia. Later rulers never forgot it. Whoever controlled the region could influence movement between civilizations. The steppe remained a crossroads. The mountains remained barriers and corridors. The deserts remained difficult but navigable. The great rivers remained routes of movement. The geography of Eurasia had not changed. Only the rulers had. And throughout history, rulers repeatedly returned to the same strategic spaces. This is one of the clearest signs of long-term historical influence. A political system may disappear, but geography remains. The Mongols understood the geography of Eurasia better than many of their enemies. Their successors inherited that knowledge. Their enemies learned from them, and the struggle for Central Eurasia continued. By the 17th century, the political world looked very different from the age of Genghis Khan. The Russian Empire was expanding across Siberia. The Qing dynasty was rising in China. The Ottoman Empire controlled enormous territories. The Mughal Empire dominated much of India. Persia had powerful dynasties. European maritime empires were spreading across the globe. The Mongol Empire was now a memory. But nearly every one of these powers operated in a world partly shaped by the Mongol transformation. The Qing rulers themselves would eventually conquer Mongolia. They would incorporate the Mongolian territories into the Chinese imperial system. This was another extraordinary reversal. Centuries earlier, Mongol armies had conquered China. Now a Chinese dynasty would conquer and control Mongolia. History had come full circle. The descendants of the conquerors were being absorbed into a new imperial order. But the name of Genghis Khan remained. His mausoleum, legends, descendants, and political memory continued to hold significance. In Mongolia, his memory became increasingly important as a symbol of national heritage. Centuries later, modern Mongolia would adopt him as perhaps its most important historical figure. His name would appear on monuments, currency, airports, universities, companies, public institutions. The man who once united the steppe would become a symbol of Mongolia itself. Yet modern memory can simplify historical figures. Genghis Khan was not simply a national hero in the modern sense. He lived in a world that had no modern nation-state. His identity was shaped by tribe, clan, family, steppe politics, and imperial ambition. His empire crossed what are now many different national borders. Modern countries claim parts of his legacy because his empire touched their histories. Mongolia, China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and many others. The Mongol Empire crossed modern political boundaries so completely that its legacy cannot belong exclusively to one modern country. It belongs to Eurasian history. And perhaps that is the most appropriate way to understand it. The Mongols were not an isolated people who suddenly appeared and disappeared. They were part of a long tradition of steppe civilizations: Scythians, Huns, Gokturks, Uyghurs, Khitans, Turkic Khaganates, and later Mongol states. The steppe repeatedly produced powerful political systems. Genghis Khan's achievement was to unite these traditions on an unprecedented scale. He created a system capable of conquering enormous territories. His descendants then transformed that system, and eventually, other empires inherited the world they had changed. The Mongol Empire was therefore both an ending and a beginning. It ended older political structures, and it began new patterns of interaction. The old world did not simply disappear, it was rearranged, and that rearrangement would shape the next several centuries. The Mongols had changed the direction of Eurasian history, but perhaps their most surprising legacy was not military. It was human. They forced people who had previously lived far apart to encounter one another. A Chinese artisan could meet a Persian merchant. A Russian prince could negotiate with a Mongol Khan. An Italian traveller could reach the court of a ruler in China. A Central Asian scholar could study Persian literature. A Muslim administrator could serve a Mongol ruler. A Christian missionary could travel across the steppe. The empire created encounters. Some were violent, some were peaceful, some were forced, some were voluntary. But they happened, and every encounter changed something. A word crossed a border. A technology crossed a border. A religion crossed a border. A story crossed a border. A disease crossed a border. A person crossed a border. History is often changed not by armies alone, but by these small movements. The Mongol Empire multiplied them. It turned Eurasia into a place where distant societies encountered one another more frequently. That was its greatest long-term transformation. And once those connections existed, they could not simply be forgotten. The world had changed. The roads had changed. The political imagination had changed. The understanding of distance had changed. The Mongol Empire was gone. But Eurasia was now permanently more connected than it had been before. The age of Genghis Khan had ended. The world he helped create continued moving forward. The Mongol Empire had changed Eurasia, but the story of its legacy was far from finished. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the descendants of the Mongol world continued to shape the political landscape of Central and East Asia. In Mongolia, powerful tribes continued to compete for influence. In China, the Qing dynasty had established control over Mongolia. In Central Asia, khanates continued to rule. In Russia, the empire was expanding rapidly across the steppe. The old political world was being replaced by something new. Large, centralized empires were becoming more powerful. The age of the independent steppe khanate was beginning to decline. Yet the geography that had once allowed the Mongols to build their empire remained unchanged. The grasslands stretched across the horizon. The great rivers continued to flow. The mountains remained. The deserts remained. And people continued to move across them. The difference was that the great powers of the early modern world now possessed new technologies. Firearms were becoming more effective. Artillery was becoming more powerful. Central governments could raise larger armies, and states could support permanent military forces. The old Mongol advantage of mobility was no longer enough by itself. Steppe societies adapted. Some adopted firearms. Some entered alliances with neighboring empires. Some became trading powers. Others were gradually absorbed. The process was slow. But over time, the independent political power of the steppe declined. Russia expanded eastward. The Qing expanded westward. Persian influence changed. The Ottoman Empire competed for influence in the Caucasus. The map of Central Asia became increasingly divided among large states. The age of the great Mongol successor states was ending. But even as political independence declined, cultural traditions survived. Horse culture survived. Steppe music survived. Oral histories survived. Tribal identities survived. The memory of Genghis Khan survived. And perhaps most importantly, the idea of the steppe as a homeland survived. In Mongolia, the memory of the great Khan became stronger with time. Genghis Khan had become more than a historical ruler. He became a symbol of unity, a symbol of independence, a symbol of military strength, a symbol of Mongolian identity. But his memory was not always celebrated. In different parts of Eurasia, memories of Mongol rule could be very different. For some communities, the Mongol period represented destruction. For others, it represented political opportunity. For merchants, it could represent expanding trade. For scholars, it could represent cultural exchange. For rulers, it could represent legitimacy. Memory depends on experience. And the Mongol Empire had created radically different experiences for different peoples. This is why the legacy of Genghis Khan remains controversial. His achievements are extraordinary. His military success was unprecedented. His political organization was remarkable. His empire connected distant civilizations. But his conquests also produced enormous suffering. Cities were destroyed. Populations were massacred. Communities were displaced. Entire regions experienced demographic collapse. The historical record contains both realities. Neither can simply be removed. To understand Genghis Khan is to understand both sides, the conqueror and the state builder, the destroyer and the organizer, the steppe warrior and the imperial ruler, the man who created one of history's greatest empires, and the man whose campaigns caused extraordinary destruction. Perhaps the most accurate description is not hero or villain, it is transformer. Genghis Khan transformed the political world around him, and once that transformation began, it could not easily be reversed. The Mongol Empire became one of the largest contiguous empires in history. Its territories stretched across enormous distances, but size alone does not explain its importance. Its importance came from connection. The empire connected regions that had previously been politically separate. It brought different economic systems into closer contact. It moved people. It moved ideas. It moved technology. It moved religions. And unfortunately, it also moved disease. The result was a more integrated Eurasian system. This system would survive the collapse of the empire. Trade routes continued. Cities continued to exchange goods. People continued to travel. Political traditions continued. The descendants of Mongol rulers continued to govern. The world had been permanently altered. And this raises another question. Could the Mongol Empire have survived? Historians have debated this for generations. Perhaps stronger succession rules could have helped. Perhaps better communication could have delayed fragmentation. Perhaps the empire was simply too large to remain unified. Perhaps the diversity of its territories made centralization impossible. There is no certain answer. But one thing is clear. The empire depended heavily on strong individual rulers. Genghis Khan was exceptional. Urjadai was capable. Mongke was powerful. Kublai was determined. But each ruler faced different circumstances. As generations passed, the personal connection to the original conquest weakened. The empire became more bureaucratic, more regional, more divided. The descendants of Genghis Khan were no longer living the same life as their ancestors. They were becoming Chinese emperors, Persian khans, Islamic rulers, Central Asian princes, steppe khans. Their interests were no longer identical. The empire therefore changed from a single political project into multiple regional projects. This was not necessarily failure. In some ways, it was the natural evolution of the Mongol achievement. A single empire had become several civilizations. The Mongols had entered history as outsiders. They ended up inside the histories of the people they conquered. Their descendants spoke different languages. They followed different religions. They adopted different political traditions, and their names became part of the histories of many countries. The Mongol Empire had disappeared, but the Mongols had not. They had become part of Eurasia. This distinction is crucial. When an empire collapses, its people do not disappear. They marry, they migrate, they settle, they change languages, they adopt religions. They create new identities. The descendants of the Mongol conquerors became part of the populations they had ruled. Over generations, the boundaries between conqueror and conquered became impossible to separate. History became mixed. Culture became mixed. Identity became mixed. And this mixture created new societies. The modern map of Eurasia is filled with these historical layers. Modern nations did not emerge from one single ancient population. They emerged from centuries of migration, conquest, trade, marriage, and cultural exchange. The Mongol period was one of the most dramatic chapters in that process, and the effects can still be seen. In language, in place names, in political traditions, in genealogy, in architecture, in food, in art, in stories. The legacy survives in ways that are sometimes obvious and sometimes invisible. Even the word Mongol became part of the vocabulary of different cultures. In South Asia, the Mughal dynasty carried the memory of the Mongol world into the early modern period. In Central Asia, Chinggisid ancestry remained politically significant. In Russia, the memory of the Golden Horde became part of the national historical narrative. In China, the Yuan Dynasty became one of the recognized dynasties of Chinese history. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan became a national symbol. One man had become part of many histories. That is perhaps the clearest evidence of his impact. Very few historical figures can be found at the intersection of so many civilizations. Genghis Khan can. His story connects East Asia with Central Asia, Central Asia with Persia, Persia with the Middle East, the steppe with Russia, the Islamic world with China, and indirectly all of them with Europe. The Mongol Empire was a bridge, but it was a violent bridge. It was built through conquest. And that contradiction is impossible to ignore. The same roads that carried merchants could carry armies. The same networks that carried books could carry disease. The same political unity that protected trade could also enable massive destruction. Connection itself is neither good nor evil. Its consequences depend on how it is used. The Mongol Empire demonstrated that on an enormous scale, and this lesson became even more important as the world entered the modern age. The connections created across Eurasia eventually expanded across oceans. Ships connected continents. Colonies connected distant economies. Global trade accelerated. The world became increasingly integrated, but the pattern remained familiar. Goods moved, people moved, ideas moved, diseases moved, power moved. The Mongol period was an early chapter in this much larger history, and perhaps this is why the empire remains so important to modern historians. It provides a glimpse of globalization before globalization had a name. It shows what happens when enormous regions become politically connected. It shows the opportunities created by connectivity, and it shows the dangers. The Mongol Empire was not modern. Its institutions were medieval. Its armies depended on horses. Its communications depended on riders. Its economy depended heavily on agriculture, pastoralism, and caravan trade. But the problems it created were surprisingly familiar. How do you govern distant populations? How do you maintain communication across enormous distances? How do you balance local autonomy with central authority? How do you protect trade? How do you control borders? How do you manage cultural diversity? How do you prevent powerful regional leaders from becoming independent? These are not exclusively medieval questions. They are questions that every large political system eventually faces. The Mongols faced them on a continental scale, and their answers shaped Eurasia for centuries. Their postal system is a good example. The relay stations allowed messages to travel quickly. Fresh horses were available. Messengers could cover enormous distances. The system connected the empire. It helped administrators communicate. It helped armies coordinate. It helped rulers receive information. It was one of the empire's great innovations. But the system depended on political stability. Once the empire fragmented, the network became regional. The same happened with trade. When the routes were secure, merchants benefited. When wars disrupted them, merchants suffered. Political unity could create economic opportunity. Political fragmentation could destroy it. Again, the relationship between empire and economy was complicated. The Mongols understood the importance of merchants. They often protected trade. They offered privileges. They encouraged long-distance commerce. They understood that wealthy merchants could generate tax revenue. But trade was never completely safe. Bandits existed. Political conflicts existed. Local rulers could impose taxes. Caravans could still be attacked. The Silk Roads were not a modern highway system. They were networks of difficult routes crossing deserts, mountains, grasslands, and politically unstable territories. The Mongol achievement was to make many of those routes more connected than before, but they could never eliminate risk. Travel remained dangerous, and for ordinary people, long-distance travel was still rare. The majority of people remained farmers, herders, craftsmen, and villagers. They lived their entire lives within relatively small geographic areas. The Mongol Empire connected their world indirectly. Taxes changed, markets changed, rulers changed, military campaigns passed through, but most people did not travel across Eurasia. This is another important reminder. Global connections can exist without everyone participating equally. A merchant might cross half a continent. A farmer might never leave his village. A ruler might communicate with distant courts. A family might spend generations in the same valley. The empire connected societies. It did not erase local life. Local cultures remained strong. Local languages survived. Local religions survived. Local traditions survived. The Mongol Empire was therefore not a single culture. It was a political framework containing many cultures. That diversity was one of its strengths and one of its weaknesses. It allowed the empire to adapt, but it also made permanent political unity difficult. The empire could tolerate differences, but its rulers could not always agree on how those differences should be governed. The question of religion became particularly important. In some regions, rulers converted to Islam. In others, Buddhist traditions became influential. In China, Mongol rulers adopted elements of Chinese imperial culture. Different regions developed different identities. Eventually, those identities became stronger than the idea of one united Mongol Empire. The family of Genghis Khan remained. The empire did not. But the political prestige of the family lasted much longer. Chinggisid princes continued to be used as symbols of legitimate rule. Even when they possessed little actual power, their ancestry could still matter. This is one of the strangest legacies of Genghis Khan. His descendants could become political symbols long after their ancestors' empire had disappeared. Bloodline became mythology. Mythology became legitimacy. Legitimacy became political power. And political power shaped the history of Central Asia for centuries. The Mongol legacy also survived through military traditions. Mounted warfare remained important. The steppe continued producing skilled horsemen. The use of mobility and archery remained influential. Even when firearms became dominant, cavalry remained part of many armies. The Mughal armies relied heavily on cavalry. The Ottoman military maintained powerful mounted units. Central Asian khanates remained dependent on horsemen. The old steppe tradition did not simply vanish. It evolved. The horse remained a symbol of freedom and power. The rider remained a central figure in steppe culture, and the memory of mounted conquest remained embedded in stories and legends. But eventually, the modern state began to replace the world of the Khanate. Borders became more fixed. Governments became more bureaucratic. Armies became professional. Tax systems became centralized. Firearms became dominant. Railways would eventually cross the steppe. Telegraph lines would connect distant cities. The old world of horseback messengers would disappear. The landscape itself would become integrated into modern systems of transportation and communication. The world that Genghis Khan knew would become almost unrecognizable, yet his name would survive. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. A man born more than 8 centuries ago remains one of the most famous figures in world history. His name is recognized across continents. His empire remains a subject of documentaries, books, academic research, museums, and historical debate. His military strategies are still studied. His political methods are still discussed. His legacy is still contested. And his story continues to fascinate because it combines almost everything that makes history compelling. Ambition, survival, war, strategy, power, betrayal, loyalty, family, religion, trade, technology, culture, and transformation. But behind all of these themes is one simple fact. The world was different after Genghis Khan. That is his ultimate historical significance. He did not simply win battles. He changed the structure of Eurasian power. He created a political system that connected enormous distances. He forced civilizations to interact. He changed the movement of people and goods. He changed the balance between settled states and nomadic powers. He created institutions that survived beyond his lifetime. And his descendants continued shaping history for generations. The empire eventually fractured, but its influence remained. And perhaps the most fitting way to end the Mongol story is not with the fall of an empire. It is with the survival of its connections. The roads continued. The cities continued. The peoples continued. The memories continued. The descendants continued. And the world continued to change. The Mongols had once ridden across the horizon as an unexpected force. Centuries later, the modern world had emerged from the consequences of their expansion. The empire was gone, but the world it helped create was still here. And somewhere in the grasslands of Mongolia, the landscape that had produced Genghis Khan remained almost unchanged. Open sky, long horizons, wind moving across the grass. A landscape that had once seemed remote from the great civilizations of Eurasia, until one man looked across it and imagined something larger, a united steppe, a powerful army, a new political order, and eventually an empire that would stretch across much of the known world. His story began with survival. It became a story of conquest. Then it became a story of empire. And finally, it became a story of transformation. The empire ended. The transformation did not. The story of the Mongol Empire does not truly end with the collapse of its political structure. It continues in the places that inherited its people, its traditions, its institutions, and its memory. The empire had once stretched across an enormous portion of Eurasia. But no empire remains unchanged forever. The Mongols had entered the world as a people of the steppe. They became conquerors, then rulers, then administrators, then members of the civilizations they had conquered. Their descendants eventually became Chinese emperors, Persian rulers, Central Asian Khans, Indian emperors, and steppe princes. The original empire disappeared, but its influence survived through generations. The roads that had carried Mongol armies later carried merchants. The cities that had suffered conquest later became centers of trade and scholarship. The territories that had once been united under one imperial system later became the foundations of new states. The world had moved forward, but it carried the Mongol past with it. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Mongol Empire is that history rarely disappears. It changes form. A political system can collapse. A dynasty can end. A capital can be destroyed. A ruler can die. But ideas can survive. Institutions can survive. Memories can survive. And people survive. The Mongol Empire transformed Eurasia because it connected people who had previously lived far apart. Those connections created both opportunity and suffering. Trade expanded, knowledge traveled, technology spread, religions crossed borders. People migrated. Diseases spread. Cities rose and fell. Political systems were destroyed and rebuilt. The consequences were enormous, and they continued long after the last great Mongol Khans had disappeared. Today, when we look at a map of Eurasia, the borders seem permanent. They are not. The borders we see today are only the latest layer of a much older story. Before them came kingdoms. Before kingdoms came tribes. Before those tribes came other peoples. Empires rose and disappeared. Languages changed. Religions spread. Cities were rebuilt. And people moved. The Mongol Empire was one of the most dramatic forces in this long process. It did not create Eurasia, but it reshaped it. It did not invent long-distance trade, but it accelerated it. It did not create cultural exchange, but it intensified it. It did not create empire, but it demonstrated how far an organized steppe power could reach. And it left a political and cultural legacy that survived for centuries. Genghis Khan died in 1227. His empire did not. His sons continued the expansion. His grandsons expanded it even farther. Later, descendants transformed it. And eventually, the empire fragmented. But fragmentation was not disappearance. The Mongol world became many worlds, and each of those worlds carried something forward. The Yuan Dynasty carried Mongol rule into Chinese history. The Golden Horde carried it into the history of Russia and the Eurasian steppe. The Ilkhanate carried it into the history of Persia and the Middle East. The Chagatai world carried it into Central Asia. The Temüjin dynasty inherited and transformed many of its traditions. The Mughal Empire carried a distant Mongol legacy into India. And even after these political structures disappeared, their descendants remained. This is why the Mongol story is not simply about one empire. It is about inheritance. One generation creates something. The next generation changes it. The next generation adapts it. Eventually, the original creation may become almost unrecognizable, but traces remain. The Mongol Empire became part of the foundations of the world that followed. And that is where the story finally comes to rest. Not with a final battle, not with one final emperor, not with a single moment when the empire disappeared, but with transformation. The horsemen of the steppe became rulers of cities. The conquerors became administrators. The outsiders became insiders. The empire became history, and history became memory. The grasslands remained. The wind continued to cross them. The same sky stretched above them. But the political world had changed forever. Genghis Khan had once looked across those grasslands and seen a future that no one else could see. He united tribes that had been enemies. He built an army that could move faster than its opponents. He created a political system capable of governing enormous distances. And he unleashed forces that would reshape Eurasia. His achievements were extraordinary. His violence was extraordinary. His consequences were extraordinary. Few individuals have changed the course of so much of the world, and perhaps that is why the Mongol Empire still fascinates us. It reminds us that history can change very quickly. A small society can become a great power. A forgotten frontier can become the centre of world politics. A single generation can reshape the lives of millions. And an empire can disappear while its influence continues for centuries. The Mongol Empire was not eternal. Nothing human is. But its impact was. The roads remained, the stories remained, the descendants remained, and the world remained changed. That is the final legacy of Genghis Khan, not simply the empire he conquered, but the world that emerged after it. A world more connected, more mobile, more politically transformed, more culturally mixed, and forever marked by the riders who once crossed the Eurasian horizon.